Welcome back to the briefing. There are two numbers that define the moment when a superpower conducts a massive foreign war while simultaneously facing internal collapse, and those numbers are 3,000 and 250,000. 3,000 is the number of synchronized protest points across the United States, where the No Kings movement is blocking infrastructure. 250,000 is the projected number of protesters in Philadelphia alone, when Bucks, Chester, Delaware, and Montgomery counties converge. 3,000 simultaneous points, 250,000 in one city. And while those protesters paralyze the nation's capital, the Trump administration conducts a war against Iran thousands of miles away. Let that sink in. Because this is not about isolated domestic dissent that the government can ignore. It is about the moment when a superpower faces a two-front war where each front undermines the other. The external front requires massive resources, political legitimacy, and a unified focus. The internal front represents the collapse of those three elements. When millions march under No Kings rejecting migration policies and militarism in the Middle East, they are denying the legitimacy of presidential decisions on war and security. Stay with me because this is not about ordinary protests where groups express specific grievances. It is about the convergence of crises that transform demonstrations into an existential threat. Crisis 1. Mobilization in 3,000 points simultaneously. You cannot suppress 3,000 locations without admitting to a police state. Crisis 2. The demographic composition reveals who has the privilege to protest. Protesters are predominantly white, 40 to 60 years old. Hispanic and African American minorities have withdrawn out of fear of ICE. Crisis 3. Trump evacuated to Mar-a-Lago during the third wave since his second term in January 2025. 3,000 synchronized protest points. When a movement can coordinate simultaneous actions across the entire national geography, it has an organizational capacity that rivals the state apparatus. It is not grassroots spontaneity. It is sustained planning and communication networks operating parallel to official government structures. Every point requires local leadership, logistics, precise time coordination. 3,000 locations means 3,000 teams operating with shared objectives and unified tactics executed in a coordinated time window. Philadelphia projects 250,000 protesters converging from four surrounding counties: Bucks, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery. That is not the urban population of a city protesting. It is an entire metropolitan region mobilizing. When four suburban counties send residents to a central urban demonstration, the movement has transcended the traditional urban-rural divide that typically fragments political opposition in the United States. Highways in Philadelphia blocked from 0500 to 1900, 5 in the morning to 7 in the evening. 14 hours of complete blockade of transport infrastructure. When a city closes main arteries for 14 hours anticipating a protest, it is admitting that the capacity to maintain normal public order has collapsed. You are not managing dissent. You are preemptively capitulating to the inevitability of massive disruption. National Guard deployed from Arlington National Cemetery to the Lincoln Memorial to the White House. Park police positioned along the Capitol's central symbolic corridor. When you deploy the military to protect national monuments and the presidential residence, you are signaling that you perceive a threat to the fundamental symbols of state authority. It is not routine security. It is the defensive fortification of icons of power against the domestic population. And here's the demographic composition that reveals the cost of immigration policy. Protesters predominantly white, 40 to 60 years old. Hispanic and African American communities absent. Withdrawal is not disinterest. It is fear. Fear of ICE arrests, deportation, being labeled a criminal, and losing legal status. When minorities with legitimate grievances cannot protest without risking the destruction of their lives, you have created an empire of fear where effective citizenship depends on ethnicity. Trump retreated to Mar-a-Lago during the third wave of the uprising, the third since his second term in January 2025. When the president evacuates the Capitol during a protest, the strategy is to deny legitimacy through physical absence. He cannot confront you if you are not present, but absence also signals that confronting protesters would produce images that undermine the narrative of control. So you retreat, hoping the movement exhausts itself without confrontation. Department of Homeland Security budget completely frozen. Democrats in Congress demand reforms to ICE as a condition for approving funding. When the security agency responsible for the border, immigration, and counterterrorism cannot operate because Congress withholds funds, the capacity to execute policy is paralyzed. It does not matter what executive orders the president signs if the agencies have no resources to implement them. And here is the dimension that makes this an existential threat to the Iran war. The No Kings movement is not just protesting immigration policies. It protests militarism in the Middle East, specifically U.S. support for Israel and the war against Iran. When millions march rejecting a foreign war simultaneously with domestic policy, they are denying the legitimacy of the entire presidential agenda. You cannot sustain a foreign war if the domestic base considers the war illegitimate and is actively working to collapse the government's capacity to fund it. Rome, Italy experiencing synchronized protests. Thousands marching against the Trump administration, specifically against militarism in Iran and the Middle East. When European capitals organize demonstrations synchronized with American protests, the movement has transcended national borders. It is not just internal dissent, it is a transnational coalition against American hegemony. Iran and China observe the internal fracture as a massive opportunity. The war of attrition that Iran is conducting against the United States militarily is reinforced by the war of attrition that the No Kings movement is conducting against the Trump administration politically. When external adversaries see the domestic population actively sabotaging the government's capacity to sustain military operations, they know that time favors resistance. They only need to survive until domestic political costs force a withdrawal. The No Kings protests reject both mass deportations and the Iran war. The unifying narrative is the rejection of a monarchical government where the president makes unilateral decisions on war and policy without genuine popular consent. When a movement frames its opposition as a rejection of monarchy in favor of genuine democracy, it is questioning the fundamental constitutional legitimacy of expanded executive power. It is not a disagreement over specific policy. It is a rejection of the framework where policy is made. If the No Kings movement escalates from street protests to massive strikes and sustained civil disobedience, the military-industrial complex and the American logistical chain will be paralyzed. Defense industries depend on workers who manufacture weapons. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman employ hundreds of thousands manufacturing missiles, aircraft, defense systems. If those workers go on strike refusing to participate in a war they consider illegitimate, production stops immediately. Ports depend on stevedores who move supplies. The International Longshore and Warehouse Union controls West Coast ports. A single day of port strikes interrupts the military supply chain for weeks. Bases depend on civilian contractors who maintain infrastructure. Sodexo, KBR, and other contractors provide food, maintenance, and logistical services on U.S. bases globally. If those contractors collectively refuse to participate in the war effort, the capability to sustain military operations collapses from within, regardless of technological superiority. DHS budget frozen, ICE with no funds for operations, National Guard deployed defending monuments, Trump evacuated to Florida, 3,000 protest points, 250,000 converging in Philadelphia, minorities withdrawn out of fear, Rome marching in sync, Iran and China observing the opportunity. When a superpower conducts a foreign war while the capital is fortified against the domestic population, every dollar spent on defense is a dollar unavailable to appease internal anger. Every soldier deployed externally is a soldier unavailable to control domestic dissent. A budget freeze means that even if Trump orders an escalation in Iran, the agencies responsible for logistics, intelligence, and coordination operate with degraded capacity. When Congress withholds funds from national security agencies during an active war, it is effectively sabotaging the war effort through bureaucratic obstruction. You don't need to vote against the war directly. You just deny the resources required to sustain it. If the budgetary confrontation is not resolved, the federal government faces a partial or total shutdown. A government shutdown during a foreign war is a catastrophic signal to global markets and military adversaries. It means the superpower cannot maintain basic government functions while simultaneously projecting power militarily. The US dollar as the global reserve currency depends on the perception of institutional stability. A government shutdown during a military conflict fundamentally erodes that perception. Hispanic and African American minorities absent from protests create a radicalized, invisible underclass. When populations cannot express grievances through democratic channels without risking deportation or arrest, resentment accumulates with no visible escape valve. History shows that oppressed populations without legitimate means of dissent eventually seek illegitimate means. The empire of fear that silences minorities today creates the conditions for violent radicalization tomorrow. The historical parallel is the 1960s during the Vietnam War. Anti-war protests started predominantly white and middle class, but when government repression escalated, the movements radicalized. Weather Underground, Black Panthers, groups that began with nonviolent resistance, evolved toward armed confrontation when peaceful avenues were systematically closed. The crucial difference now is that minorities are already pre-silenced before radicalization begins. They do not experience the arc from peaceful protest to violent resistance. They jump directly to accumulated resentment without public expression, because public expression means deportation. 3,000 simultaneous points, 250,000 Philadelphia, 0500 to 1900 blockades, Arlington to Lincoln to White House fortified, 40 to 60-year-old whites protesting, Hispanics, African Americans withdrawn, fear of ICE, DHS budget frozen, Trump Mar-a-Lago third wave, Rome synchronized militarism, Iran, China observing opportunity, strikes, disobedience, logistical collapse, Congress denies funds, bureaucratic sabotage, minorities silenced, future radicalization. What happens when you conduct a foreign war while 3,000 domestic points paralyze infrastructure? What happens when the capital is fortified against its own population? What happens when minorities are silenced by fear? What happens when the president evacuates during an uprising? What happens when Congress denies funds to security agencies during a war? What happens when Europe marches in sync against your militarism? What happens when adversaries see the population sabotaging the war effort? You are in a two-front war where each front undermines the other, where 3,000 points means a rival organizational capacity, where a 250,000 convergence transcends the urban-rural divide, where 14-hour blockades admit the collapse of public order, where capital fortification signals a threat to the symbols of power, where demographic composition reveals an empire of fear, where presidential absence denies legitimacy through evasion, where a frozen budget paralyzes the capacity to execute policy, where the rejection of a foreign war unites with the rejection of immigration policies under an anti-monarchical narrative, where European synchronization creates a transnational coalition, where adversaries know time favors resistance, and where a silenced population today is violent radicalization tomorrow.